To me, the framework to think about Chinese elite politics today is, it's three F's that I think of, right? So there is faith, there is fear, and there is fruits. Faith is where Xi Jinping sits, right? Pledging loyalty to him is critical. His ideas today are the ideas of the party, and that's why his position remains very difficult to shake. Fear is that even if you don't buy his ideas and his thinking, you're going to abide by it because the stick will come for you. So even if you don't adhere to his ideas in terms of how policies must be implemented, how targets must be achieved, if you pretend that you're achieving something but you're actually not, and that's discovered, there's a cat and mouse game of inspections that goes on. You will, not just in democratic societies, politics is a matter of life. In such politics is a matter of life and death. So you will end up losing your life.
Right now, the debate, I would think the central debate inside the party would be, should we acknowledge the old, lies, etc., that we foisted upon our people, and go for a debt default? That would be a very, very rare decision, and only a communist government can do it. Should we opt for a debt default and a reset? That's number one. Two, should we go the normal way, treat it like an ordinary cycle, and inflict savings repression on the people, go through a normal depression, and the reaction to a depression, to try to create more money? I don't know too many occasions when somebody has revived trust in a currency, in a monetary system, after doing what China has done.
How do you interpret this ambiguous, broad ideological statement that Xi Jinping has given? That's where contestation happens. And that's where factional fighting is happening today. So if you think from that perspective, yes, there is a Fujian PLA unit, clique. There is a Shaanxi PLA clique. There are other groupings which are competing, right? And which may be competing for influence. And position is influence, right? Position is policy influence. So you're competing for position also for your guys.
Something that one must acknowledge that China is doing well, in parts, in AI, in certain frontline areas. China seems to be stripping ahead of the pack. Now, I've seen China do this again and again in the various commodities. They will come in. There will be secret forces in every sector. They will gain global dominance. You will not, I'm saying this as a micro competitor to China, and let's say petchem and steel, etc. We couldn't understand what kind of cost structure could have justified what they were doing in global markets. And we couldn't do anything till they got to 60% share. After they got to 60% share, you discover that they don't make money. It is all non-money. Somebody else is making money, the state is making money, and finding a secret way to pump in subsidies. So what you have is pigeon chesting, nothing but pigeon chesting.
The real interesting question is not the conspiracies that float around today. The real interesting question is, at some point of time in the near future, whether because of nature, accident, or force, Xi Jinping will exit the stage. How does the transition from that period get managed? To me, that's the sort of risky period for China politically and also from an economic point of view. Whenever that happens, we'll have to wait and see where things are at that point of time. If it was to happen tomorrow, that nature takes Xi Jinping away from the world, you end up in a situation where, to me, you will see a power vacuum.
Okay, so something's up in China, and you should be paying very close attention. No, this isn't conspiracy theory. In fact, this is just the opposite. It's an attempt to give you insight, understanding, and clarity. I'm talking serious military purges with profound implications for the political and strategic decision-making hierarchy in the Chinese leadership. And all of this amidst economic turmoil and a bruising trade war with the Trump administration in the US. I have with me Manoj Kewalramani. He's the chairperson of the Indo-Pacific Studies program at the Takshashila Institution. He's also a senior associate Freeman Chair in China Studies with the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He's also a senior associate fellow at Merrick's. He wears a lot of hats. Also joining us is Sanjeev Pandya. He's a behavioral economist focusing on the psychological drivers of volatility in markets. He's a trader, of course, and business transformation coach, and has been keeping a very close eye on the Chinese economy. Welcome, gentlemen. Great to have you on Over the Horizon.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so let's begin by looking at the recent military purges. He Weidong, the vice chairman of the Chinese Military Commission, was reportedly arrested and then removed from public view or disappeared, as it's referred to by China watchers, in March of this year. Now, remember, the Central Military Commission, as CMC, stands really at the pinnacle of military authority in China. It's the highest decision making body for the country's armed forces, and it also integrates military strategy with broader geopolitical objectives of the Chinese Communist Party. Now, the
Mm.
CMC oversees the PLA, that's the People's Liberation Army, the People's Armed Police, and this includes the China Coast Guard and militia forces. So it's pretty damn important. So He Weidong was replaced by General Zhang Yoxia. Now, this name is something you should remember because he's central to a lot of what's happening in China. He's been considered close to President Xi Jinping, like He Weidong, whom he replaced, but recent developments now suggest a shift in his allegiances, and Zhang now potentially even challenging Xi's control amidst these ongoing military purges, one of which was against Miao Hua, the director of the CMC Political Work Department, who was officially sacked and then expelled in June. Interestingly, his replacement, Executive Deputy He Hongjun, died by suicide in custody. And as of July, Dong Jun, the Minister of National Defense, is reportedly under investigation for corruption, again initiated by General Zhang Yoxia. I told you, remember that name. And now, earlier in July 2023, Li Yushao, the commander of the PLA rocket force, was disappeared and then sacked amidst a major rocket force corruption scandal. This is a guy who was handpicked by President Xi. Admiral Wan Hobin, who was an outsider from the Navy, was appointed as the new commander of the rocket force. Now, these are just a few among many high-level theater command and group army leaders who've either been completely disappeared or sacked. Most of them built their careers, remember, under Xi Jinping and his military patronage network. So it's pretty darn important what we're seeing happening here. So, Manoj, can you just kick us off by giving us your high-level view of what we've been witnessing in these military purges?
Hey, so let me just have a few correctives here. So Zhang Yaoxia is a old hand. He's really old compared to the hierarchy. He's 75 years of age. He is extremely close to Xi Jinping, and he has been there as the vice chairman of the Central Military Commission for much longer than He Weidong existed in that position. So He Weidong is somebody who was promoted out of turn, and he's, like you said, not been seen in public since late March. There's no confirmation whether there is a case against him, whether he's been detained. But usually, when people vanish for such a long period of time in the Chinese system, that's what is usually happening. In terms of whether these cases are being conducted by, whether there is a factional component to this, whether Zhang Yaoxia is involved, it's difficult to say. I wouldn't rule out the fact that there is a factional component because Zhang Yaoxia comes from Shaanxi, He Weidong's experience is from a different province. And there is
Shaanxi is where the old boys are, right, around Xi Jinping.
So Xi Jinping has a Shaanxi connection, Xi Jinping has a Fujian connection, Xi Jinping has a Shanghai connection. So Xi Jinping has coteries in different places. Xi Jinping has a Tsinghua University connection, and there are people from that network also. So my sort of high-level take on Chinese politics today, including what's happening in the PLA, is that essentially everybody is a Xi Jinping person, right? So the other factions are essentially neutralized. They're not vanished, they exist, but they're neutralized. What we are seeing is competition play out.
That's a nice euphemism.
Yeah. So, at a certain level, what we're seeing is competition taking place within these different groupings underneath the authority and the position of Xi Jinping. So I don't think his position, his authority.
Or so it appears.
No, I don't think his position and his authority is in any danger. I think he is today Generally general secretaries for the last 30, 40 years have been, first among equals. Xi Jinping is not first among equals. Xi Jinping is above these individuals today.
Correct.
So I don't think his position is in any danger. I think what's, however, happening is that there is factional competition underneath his position, and as part of that
Mm.
competition, you're using elements like corruption, you're using elements like lack of performance, lack of delivery, knowing the fact that Xi Jinping himself has an urgency in terms of achieving certain goals and objectives. He's not a young man, he's 71 years old. He's already crossed the age thresholds, which are the norm in Chinese domestic politics. So, to me, that's how I would contextualize what's happening, right? That there is a competition of factions, but all those factions are not necessarily competing to oust Xi Jinping. They are competing to curry favor, and to do so, they are competing within the rubric that he's laid down, which is of performance, which is of non-corruption and things like that.
We're also seeing a resurgence of the old guard within the CCP. Just very briefly, can you tell us what the old guard is and what is this resurgence we're seeing?
Yeah, so these are, if I go back to 2012 when Xi Jinping became General Secretary. From then we are hearing of, since then there are, I can document rumors every year about party elders taking him to task. At 71 years of age, I think Xi Jinping himself is one of the party elders today. So I don't know which party elders people are talking about. People, the latest rumors talk about Hu Jintao pulling the strings. And, if you remember Hu Jintao at the 20th Party Congress in October 2022, he was in a physical shape where he could barely stand up himself. So it's really difficult to imagine
Right.
him pulling power strings.
Yeah.
Likewise, the rumors that currently talk about, the Tuanpai faction or the Communist Youth League faction, which Hu Jintao is associated with, uh, coming back to power and bringing Wang Yang, who is just retired from the Politburo a few years ago, from Politburo Standing Committee a few years ago, him coming back. Look, Wang Yang ran Guangdong. He's an important reformist figure. But I don't see him coming back to power. He doesn't have the popular base that Xi Jinping had, that Xi Jinping has today. And I don't think that there is this secretive group of elders. To me, these are the system of the Communist Party's politics has changed today. This is not the 1980s, the late 1980s, where you had
That's
an
right.
old guard of revolutionaries, with Deng Xiaoping and the eight elders who could do things. This is
Yeah.
not that environment. The environment is completely different. There are no elders taking Xi Jinping to task. He is in command of the system. That doesn't mean there isn't political competition. It just
Mm.
means it's not of the nature that we are imagining.
Yeah, and we'll get into the weeds with that, with the nature of the political competition and why we need to understand it. And as I just told my viewers in my introduction, that this is an attempt to sift political conspiracy theories and put them aside and just look at the facts and try and make sense of what's happening and how these military purges and the timeline of these military purges is intersecting, if we and to see what it means when it intersects with the economic turmoil that China is going through in macro. And so let me just look at the macro characters of the Chinese economy. And when you look at the Chinese economy, it's been facing significant challenges, right, since 2024, and that's an understatement, right? So this includes slowing growth, deflation, trade pressures, um, and all of this is running parallel to these military purges. There's been unemployment that's hovering at about 14.9% as of May. Official GDP growth has slowed to 4.8% in the first three quarters of 2024. Some estimate put it even lower as 2.4%. Declining productivity, high debt, an aging population, societal issues. Um, the real estate sector in China has collapsed. The property market crisis, of course, if you remember Evergrande's court-ordered liquidation in January 2024, $300 billion in liabilities there. So China's been grappling with entrenched deflation really since early 2024. The CPI, Consumer Price Index, dropping to negative 0.7% year on year by Feb 2025. And let's not forget President Donald Trump and the Trump administration. The U.S. tariffs on Chinese goods reached a peak of 145% in April, disrupting exports, forcing the closure of many manufacturing units, and a lot of unemployment in some of the major Chinese manufacturing districts. Sanjeev, what do you make of these macro conditions in China?
I'll just step back from this discussion and try to first make a high level point. See the specifics of whether the reaction on the military. I heard some 90 generals, some 90 police and military officers have been moved around or have disappeared, etc. So we don't know the specifics, but we know that some reaction in the military is happening, which is perhaps the reason why we've got together to try and make sense out of what is happening in China. So if I step back and try to look at the result of what China has been going through. So just to set the context, I think that China got it wrong in the growth phase itself. It is how we've seen repeating cycles of it, how the communists get it wrong everywhere, from Bengal to Russia. There is an initial spurt. So I would liken China, mostly I tend to think of democracies as a herd. They move in a confused fashion. Usually they follow what is called a bell curve. So, that's probably a different rabbit hole. I'll take you through it some other time. But people move in patterns. Now, communists move in an army column. They don't move in a herd-like fashion. So they don't follow a complex, raggedy fashion of movement. They follow what looks like a very organized, good-looking movement. And they are good-looking even when they're going over a cliff. So they will always do more than, let's say, a democracy would have done, because a democracy has self-learning and self-correcting mechanisms within it that that hold back.
It's a system of checks and balances that kind of keeps you.
Yeah, you could call it that.
On the big picture.
In a boom bust sequence, I would say, I would liken China. The closest example we have had in recent years is the Japan story. So Japan did a few things right and earned a lot of money, and we saw, various kinds of things happen to Japan. One, there was a saving surplus, then the money got misused, then the cost of capital dropped, etc., etc. In case of China, that excess money came not from doing something right and selling to somebody outside, let's say America, and getting money from there. It came essentially from what I call a John Law movement. Artificial money was created. You were made to feel good, and that chimera was kind of carried longer and stronger, and people found out much later than, let's say, in a democracy. So in a democracy, this would have stopped at, say, 120% of GDP. In China, it went on to, the last number I heard was 387% of GDP. So total debt, the creation of debt, led to the creation of artificial money. And what we are seeing is, there is more to learn from John Law's, experience in France, what it did to France, and from that you can probably guess where China is headed. The rest of what we are seeing is just the details, whether it is going to show up in the military, whether it is going to show up in geopolitics. Actually, China is a false money story. So you've got to. So there's two different examples which I want to introduce. One is France, the creation of false money. And what happens to false money? Suddenly there's a loss of trust. There is a last man. And when you're holding, in this game of musical chairs, the last man holding the baby suddenly goes bankrupt. And everybody around him, they sort of craterizes. Okay, that's the John Law movement. Then comes the solutions package. Which solutions do you choose? Do you choose a debt default and a reset, like the Weimar Republic, and then you start all over again? Or do you choose savings repression, where you kind of distribute the pain, like Japan did, and you suffer for the next 30 years? Which way China will go, I won't try to guess, although it looks very likely that they will choose the savings repression route. Um, so this is, shall we say, the first chapter of the story. So I'm just trying to set the historical context for why all this happened, and uh, you know, uh, going forward, what route it will take will be probably what we need to discuss. But
Okay.
how China got here
Yeah.
is that everything from real estate to all those
Yeah.
holes in the
Yeah. Yeah.
economy,
Yeah.
which the market is already discounting. The
Yeah.
market is saying that China is, let's say, an eight
So,
and a
so then
half
this is a
trillion.
question to both of you, and Manoj, the pain that the economic pain, the fiscal pain that Sanjeev was just talking about. In what, how would you say that various layers of this, unemployment, inflation, how does this erode the CCP's centralization of power and their political mandate, if at all?
Yeah, look, my view is that the Communist Party of China today enjoys far more legitimacy than it has for the longest time. I think that there are obviously always going to be pockets of discontent. But just to sort of push back on some of these things, I think that historically analysts, when they've looked at the Communist Party of China, they've said, the famous Gordon Chang syndrome, right? Over the next 5 years, it's going to collapse. What the Communist Party has shown us is that it is able to adapt. So while you may look at it from a distance and they may look like marching in one line and column, there's actually tremendous decentralization in terms of how things have gotten done historically. Under Xi Jinping, that effort has been reversed. You're seeing far more centralization of power and power, authority, and even methodology of execution of policies. And that's to their detriment. So that's actually negative, but it's not because it's become decentralized, it's because it's become far more concentrated in the central authority. Xi Jinping today is telling people that, look, not only must you follow the ideas that I'm espousing, but also implement policies. Your actions must be in line with how I'm asking you to do things. So he's demanding far more conformity. The reason for China's growth over the past, since 1978, 1980, was because they loosened those strings of conformity, and they allowed regions and localities to experiment, to innovate within a broad guideline of policy. So the policy was that we must engage with the outside world. How you engage was left to localities and to provinces and to cities to try and do, and they competed with each other to try and do that, which is why they attracted different kinds of specializations and different kinds of capital and skills. Today, there's far more centralization where you're not allowing this competition to play out. So that is the fundamental challenge of the Chinese economy. The
Yeah, but
second part,
that's but just to push back on that, that centralization also will exist as long as there is no social upheaval. And we've seen, as you also said, these pockets of unrest, right? Whether it's the bust of the housing market, whether there was it's the withdrawals crisis that was there a few months back. A lot of protests on the streets in China. People wanted to withdraw their money from banks, but they were just locked out. So it's not as if, I mean, if you scratch the surface, there are problems that are severe within the Chinese economy,
let
and
me
there are social
let me
ramifications for that as well.
it's obvious that there will be problems for any large country, for any large economy. You will have these issues. There is no issue with that. What I'm Firstly, when we look at protests in China, it's a protest can have a systemic impact if it is able to have a concentrated if adverse effect where you're able to get a lot mass of people on the streets, and the possibility of that to happen across cities. When China abandoned zero COVID, that's what
Mm,
happened, right?
mm.
You were able to get a countrywide protest essentially around against a particular policy, and you saw eventually the state adapted and it gave up the policy despite it being so ideologically linked to it.
Right. So
On the
this is,
other
so you're saying this is not the China of the Tiananmen Square times.
hand, you will see repression if repression is required,
Yeah.
but in the repression, let's not overlook the adaptability. There is adaptability, there is a willingness to be able to. Xi Jinping 5 years ago, uh, a few years ago, sidelined private sector, sidelined Jack Ma, cracked down on the private sector.
Yeah.
Earlier this year, he got all these
Can
private
he
taxis.
still do things like that, do you think?
I think he can still do things like that, but I think he's realized, particularly after DeepSeek gave him this awakening,
Mm.
that I need the private sector, right? So he's reversed course in a matter of 4 years from completely chastising the private sector, particularly the private tech sector, to now telling them in February this year that you are our own and we must work with you. So my argument is that we must not ignore the adaptability of the Communist Party. It has
Mm.
not survived for 104 years just because it has been rigid.
True. So Sanjeev, do you think that adaptation is being forced on the CCP and on Xi because of the economic conditions?
There's one sort of unchanging factor that I see. China's stock market seems to have a consistently low opinion about its economy. It is fixed at, barring that rare and one time, which since it was a first in 2007, we saw that excess liquidity in the system, take them up to about, I think, 120% of GDP. China has consistently been around 65-70% of GDP, which in a democratic country is nearly depression valuations. So through all these actions, I'm going to trust somebody who knows more than me, which is the market. Okay, and I find that the market is very, very consistent through all of this. I have seen in the China narrative, there's always a new skirt in town. There is their real estate which is going up. There is their bullet trains. There is their highways. Then there is AI. There is always some new thing which everybody in the world is talking about.
Yeah, AI, robotics,
Yet,
and space seems to be this new skirt.
so that's the latest skirt in town. But through all these narratives, I don't find one thing changing. They don't make money. Okay, I've competed directly in almost about multiple businesses.
Yeah, Sanjeev, it's interesting you say this because look at what's happened with BYD.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, BYD is an individual story. What
Yeah.
I'm saying is, if everything that China was doing, China today has, say, 37% of global manufacturing capacity, 61% of all commodities capacity. So in most commodities, they have 50 to 65% share. Yet the market leader in that industry, if you go company by company, is from the remaining 40%. All of China, take steel, some 220 odd steel companies, but with an average minimum economic size of 3 million. India has about 10 million, but a much more consolidated. So steel, petchem, pharma, chemicals, you look at any of these industries, you will find that the world leader is the survivor from the 40% market share. While China has that dominant 60% share, but nobody makes money. And it's all, a set of pygmies. They're all individually, all of them are pygmies. There's no world leader from that sector. So again and again, whether you see it in commodities or in intermediates or even now high tech, you are finding that China is a master at fragmenting things, getting loads of people, putting tons of capital. I remember reading somewhere that it was taking 6 units of debt to get 1 unit of GDP at one time, at the peak of that.
Which is unsustainable.
Which is I mean, we are seeing what happened. That pump priming, or whatever you want to call it, that pump priming has led to this 387% of GDP, and there's debt all over the system. You don't know what to define as government debt. You don't know what to define as SOE debt. You can't tell what is guaranteed debt. But it's all creation of money, which hasn't led to concomitant GDP, and the market knows it. That is why the market is valuing an 18 trillion economy at 8.5 trillion. So this is something where China stands alone. No country in the world that claims to be a growth economy, 10% growth, 9% growth, 12% growth, has ever had a stock market that has no respect for that growth. Same way, you look at their so-called investment. They have been above 40%, almost above 40% investment ratio for almost 20 years. That is cumulative 200% of GDP. That 200% of GDP seems to have produced FAF. And we can pinpoint where that FAF is. All of it seems to be in real estate. and highways and infrastructure. We saw all this in Japan, those highways to Hokkaido that nobody would travel in, the train with one passenger and all that. So all that part of the Chinese economy in an environment where we don't get much data, I have to go by trends.
Yeah,
So
data
I'm
is
not.
another problem with the
Data is
from
always a
population
problem.
to economic parameters.
So
Yeah.
actually that's where I think my sort of understanding is important. I am a non-data man. I look at trends and I always assume away the data. So then you get to the roots of behavior. Now, if I were to build a theory that everything that China is going through would be explained if half their economy is missing. If half that activity were to, which is what the market is telling us, if half the activity was a pure lie, let's say their population is a lie, their real estate is a lie, their activity is a lie, the
And the
debt is a
numbers are
lie.
out that prove that the population is largely exaggerated. The demographic crisis is very real in China.
So you take all of these, we can go down each individual rabbit hole. You take
Hmm.
all of these, and then if you assume that all of
Yeah,
this is lie, then it all makes sense. Then you put that in any democratic country, and that's what you'll get.
interesting, interesting. So, data, data, data. You can't make bricks without clay. So, Manoj, just flipping back to the military purges. So, we're seeing this economic crisis now. How, in the light of this, how do you see the economic audits of military industries linking to the purges that we're seeing, and this fiscal crisis in China? So, you have military corruption accelerating. You have these high-level dismissals, and then you have these purges in President Xi's Fujian clique.
Hmm.
Now, these kind of signal internal fractures to some extent in the PLA loyalty, but they also signal a lot of pressure on President Xi to clean house.
Hmm.
I think the last great effort at house cleaning that we saw was about 10 or 12 years back. So is this cyclical, or is this brought on by a combination of factors that she cannot afford to ignore anymore and must, as you said, course correct?
Yeah. So, look, my view is I don't think China is dealing with an economic crisis. A crisis is a big word, firstly. Secondly, on the military thing, I think it's dealing with an economic transformation. Whether the transformation will be successful or not, we'll find out in time. From the point of view of this military situation, look, Xi Jinping has been cleaning house ever since he took charge. He's been sacking people. I mean, last data for a couple of years ago was that ever since he became general secretary, there have been some 6 million people who've been taken down for corruption. The Communist Party today is about 100 million members, right? So about 6% at least have been taken down for corruption, and a sizable number of that have been people at very high levels of office. What he's so if there is a real problem, the problem is that, well, if you've been cleaning us for so long, when do we expect some of this purity and cleanliness to demonstrate, to show itself, right? So that to me is a problem. From the point of view of whether, like I said, to me, the framework to think about Chinese elite politics today is, it's three F's that I think of, right? So there is faith, there is fear, and there is fruits. Faith is where Xi Jinping sits, right? Pledging loyalty to him is critical. His ideas today are the ideas of the party, and that's why his position remains very difficult to shake. Fear is that even if you don't buy his ideas and his thinking, you're going to abide by it because the stick will come for you. So even if you don't adhere to his ideas in terms of how policies must be implemented, how targets must be achieved, if you pretend that you're achieving something but you're actually not, and that's discovered, there's a cat and mouse game of inspections that goes on. You will, not just in democratic societies, politics is a matter of life. In such politics is a matter of life and death. So you will end up losing your life, right? And finally comes fruits, which is where essentially the fruits of policy and fruits of policy and money are distributed, but also where contestation for which viewpoint on a particular issue sustains. How do you interpret this ambiguous, broad ideological statement that Xi Jinping has given? That's where contestation happens, and that's where factional fighting is happening today. So if you think from that perspective, yes, there is a Fujian PLA unit, clique. There is a Shaanxi PLA clique. There are other groupings which are competing, right? And which may be competing for influence. And position is influence, right? Position is policy influence. So you're competing for position also for your guys. And the Chinese system, the Leninist party state system, is a system of patron client relationships. So if you have your guy at the highest echelons, you will have his clients at different places in the party, right? So you cultivate that network. So that's where you see this factional contestation going on. To me, what's happening in the PLA today is not an economic crisis. I mean, the PLA's budget year on year has been increasing by 7+%, right? So there's a lot of money that's being dedicated to modernization. The challenge is, can you modernize fast enough? And when the
Right.
leadership starts to realize that the modernization that is being promised is not being delivered by the brass below him, you will see such purges taking place. And people at parallel levels will leverage the failures of others to facilitate purges of their rivals. And to me, that's what's going on right now.
True. True. So, Sanjeev, what would be the three canaries in the coal mine, so to speak, in the Chinese economy, macro, and the Chinese market that you would say would signal serious upheaval is around the corner, political upheaval?
Well, I don't know whether I would call it a canary, but I am seeing it in three parts. Number one, are we agreed that China got here with an element of non-money? Was there an element of fraudulent money? So, which explains the root of the problem. If half, if that would lead to half the economy being non-existent, okay, you will see that represented by real estate bubbles, you will see it represented by excess debt, and stuff like that. Okay, so this is one part of the story. The second is a part of the story. So if you can call that the second category, is the current ongoing debate, which will be represented by these. I see the what we are talking about in the PLA, etc., as symptoms of a larger debate. That larger debate is, where does China go from here? You have a problem. Okay, you've got here, and you've got to a certain dominance in some parts of the economic world and the geopolitical world, and some you have some missing legs. Now,
Yeah, and from what
from here,
Manoj is saying, there seems to be an acknowledgement of these problems to a great extent, which is why
yeah,
you're seeing a course
I feel
correction and purges and other things.
I felt a little educated with Manoj's point, that the Communist Party does react. I would not normally have given them credit. I would have assumed that this is just another communist, uh, party, or just another communist formation, which is going to follow the normal cycle of communist rise and decline. So if they are not that, then this discussion becomes doubly important, because right now the debate, I would think the central debate inside the party would be, should we acknowledge the old lies, etc., that we foisted upon our people, and go for a debt default? That would be a very, very rare decision, and only a communist government can do it. Should we opt for a debt default and a reset? That's number one. Two, should we go the normal way, treat it like an ordinary cycle, and inflict savings repression on the people, go through a normal depression, and the reaction to a depression, try to create more money? I don't know too many occasions when somebody has revived trust in a currency, in a monetary system, after doing what China has done. After that kind of asset destruction, I don't know. Japan took 35 years. That's the latest, example that we have of getting the credibility of the currency back. So this is the second one. Third is something that one must acknowledge, that China is doing well in parts, in AI, in certain frontline areas. Uh, China seems to be stripping ahead of the pack. Now, I've seen this China do this again and again in the various commodities. They will come in. There will be secret forces in every sector. They will gain global dominance. You will not. I'm saying this as a micro competitor to China, and let's say petchem and steel, etc. We couldn't understand what kind of cost structure could have justified what they were doing in global markets, and we couldn't do anything till they got to 60% share. After they got to 60% share, you discover that they don't make money. It is all non-money. Somebody else is making money, the state is making money, and finding a secret way to pump in subsidies. So what you have is pigeon chesting, nothing but pigeon chesting. When the pigeon chesting stops, and it stops very dramatically, and then China withdraws from that sector, suddenly the global leader will emerge. Now, this is a repeating cycle. I can personally, count something like 11 sectors where the Indian global leader has gone through a very, very similar cycle. You don't understand what China is doing, and then suddenly China withdraws, and you find that actually China was doing nothing but just getting to 60% and destroying the profits in 60% of that sector. So
That's what dumping
going
is all about,
forward,
isn't it?
yeah, so going forward, that is no longer an option. In the new world, it is your own country. You now have a consumption problem, and you're not going to be able to export your way out of this mess.
Yeah, that's an important point
So
because
that's the
with the Trump administration's trade maneuverings and attempts to friendshore and onshore much of the supply chain, critical supply chains, manufacturing sections. This is an important point to take note of. But Manoj, let's also look at another aspect that we mentioned briefly. So there's been so much talk about the old guard within the CCP, with the likes of Hu Jintao and his network. Do you think? Do you think there's a possibility that this old guard could be forcing a sort of a trusteeship model on President Xi, and this course correction that we're seeing is an outcome of that?
I'm highly skeptical that this is an outcome of, like I say, when people say elements within the PLA, when people say old guard, I ask them who. And if you look at who, you can't find the people, right? So Songping, very very old. Hu Jintao, largely immobile, was incontinent at the 20th Party Congress. Uh, at the 20th Party Congress, the Politburo was reduced from 25 to 24 members. The only person excluded was Hu Chunhua, who was at one point of time seen as a Communist Youth League faction member who could succeed Xi Jinping, right? A young rising star. So
Right.
I don't see who these people are who are going to be manufacturing this. And to me, I think this is a lot of, Bill Bishop uses this term and I agree with him. There's a lot of opium being smoked. We need to be, I think that we need to deal with China as it is, which is that Xi Jinping is here to stay. Now, the real interesting question is not the conspiracies that I float around today. The real interesting question is, at some point of time in the near future, whether because of nature, accident, or force, Xi Jinping will exit the stage. How does the transition from that period get managed? To me, that's the sort of risky period for China politically and also from an economic point of view. Whenever that happens, we'll have to wait and see where things are at that point of time. If it was to happen tomorrow, that nature takes Xi Jinping away from the world, you end up in a situation where, to me, you will see a power vacuum.
Yeah.
You are likely to see
It's
some.
interesting you say that because there was a lot of speculation when there was about a 2.5 week disappearance. He was
Yeah,
out of sight from the front pages of newspapers. He was, this was, I think, in May, June. So there
yeah,
was a lot of speculation swirling about his health.
yeah. Look, to me, again, those speculations are that is one useful indicator of something that might be going on. But Xi Jinping has vanished from newspaper headlines for longer than that in the past decade and a bit. So to me, that was not a huge issue. And even if he was not seen publicly, but he was actually reported to be doing things. So yes, there might have been something that's going on. It could. He's a 71-year-old man. He could have pulled his back. There could have been something that's happened. Who knows? But if he was to exit the scene, to me, it's useful for the people around the world, particularly policymakers, thinkers, to try and game out what are the possible outcomes. There are many avenues in which things could go, right? The system could crumble. You could end up seeing some sort of a backstop in terms of new bargaining amongst people. You could see one or two of his trusted lieutenants sort of taking charge. Tsai Chi is one particular person who I think is in a position. The premier Li Qiang is somebody who's in a position that he might take charge. But they will all be weakened. They will all be weakened because the primary patron is gone. So you might see the party then sort of rally around for a moment, but also fragment, like things happened after Mao's death. You know,
Right.
you can see many different kinds of outcomes, and it's really important for countries around the world, given China's centrality to the global economy, to sort of game what are the
And geopolitics.
and geopolitics to sort of game what are the possibilities that could take place. It could also be that Xi Jinping is in power till 2035 and he's hale and hearty. Chinese leaders don't die young. People who reach the top of the Communist Party tend to live well into the 90s. Mao was the one who, amongst all the general secretaries so far, since the PRC, Mao was the youngest to have died and he was in his 80s. So, we shouldn't, again, let's not hope, but it's useful to game this out and be prepared.
Interesting. Yeah. We're running out of time, but I just wanted to quickly get your thoughts on this new tariff and trade war, this new shift in American manufacturing and raw material sourcing, how it affects China politically and economically. Just give me your high-level thoughts, because I'd love to go down this rabbit hole in another discussion with you guys. So very quickly. Manoj, let's start off with you.
So I think the tariff war is a challenge, right? The rise of tariffs is a challenge. That said, if you look at China's data from this year so far, foreign trade data, its foreign trade has actually increased, right? It's exporting more. The trade to US has fallen, but trade to ASEAN countries has grown phenomenally. Trade to India has grown phenomenally. So there is obviously some degree of transshipment rerouting that's taking place, a substantial degree of that which is taking place. Trump's tariffs across the board will obviously hurt that also, because Trump is not just hitting at China. He's learned from the previous administrations and he's hitting other countries also. But that also creates openings for China in terms of bargaining for deals with other countries. So yes, to me, that is a problem. The trade war is a problem for China for its exports. Exports contribute a substantive 80-90% of China's GDP. So it is a problem. But the primary problem of that is what it does to employment at home, right? About 200 million, anywhere between 180 to 200 million people in China are believed to be working in the foreign trades segment. So what sort of an impact does that have on employment, and whether that can then have political ramifications is something that we'll see. For the moment, I think both China and the US, given their talks in Geneva, then London, are essentially trying to buy time, because it's not like higher prices of goods is something that Americans are also very happy with. Right? It's not like American traders are also very happy with this inconsistency in policy on a daily basis, right? You cannot wake up one day and know that there is 10% tariffs. Next day you wake up, there's 35% tariffs. As companies, you also need certainty. All businesses need certainty. So I think that, yes, there is this pressure that's going to sustain, and it's sort of a game of chicken between the two sides in terms of who can buy greater time, who can bear greater degree of pain. To me, in some ways, I would assume that the Chinese would be much more comfortable bearing a greater degree of pain. They have prepared their society for a greater degree of
Culturally
pain,
too, yes, absolutely.
and than the US.
Yeah.
On rare earths and critical minerals, I think that in the long run, it's a self-defeating policy. The more you coerce, the more others will look for alternatives. But in the short run, which is the run in which all of us live and all of us spend and all of us survive, it's painful for consumers. So when, there's a reason why you're seeing the Indian EV ecosystem going up to the government and saying, you need to talk to them. There's a reason why you can see the Europeans making a beeline to Beijing and saying, set up a green channel for us. Your deal is with the Americans. So in the short run, it hurts businesses and politically also in other countries. In the long run, I think it's a self-defeating policy because others will look for alternatives.
Sanjeev, your thoughts?
Okay, I will just put that into a rabbit hole. The tariff wars are more Trump's problem than China's problem. So that's a complicated thing. It has, if you study tariffs carefully, you will find that it has more of America and its structural, problems and the reaction to that So Trump is trying to solve a good problem very badly. That's a different rabbit hole. He is trying to do something about a problem. At least he's acknowledging the problem, the twin deficits, but he's probably doing it badly.
Yeah, because it's
Then
not just
coming,
tariffs; it's also trade barriers, and that
it's
he's
the
trying to
whole
address.
American balance sheet.
Yeah,
It's the entire American way of doing things, of using currency, etc. It's a completely different rabbit hole. We can go down it some other time. Coming to China's reaction to what is happening to it, this may not be immediately China's doing, but now China needs to react to what is anyway happening to it. China has its own balance sheet problem, which is more of a consumption ratio problem. China has focused entirely and, in fact, predominantly on investment as the vehicle for economic growth, and that has to stop. And that investment was created its export economy. So China's export orientation is actually coming first from a need to invest. The excess savings from keeping its people's consumption down had to be used somewhere. So the only market you had was exports. So this, to that extent, China is part of the problem.
yeah.
That it
And in
started.
this new scenario, if you can't keep up those exports, you need to supplement it with a strong domestic consumption market, right?
So that's one point that I wanted to make. The second point, traditionally in a trade war, it is always the fellow who has put up capacity who loses in the long run, because he's the one with the pink elephants to feed. If you set up investment, if you set up industrial capacity for demand that doesn't exist, then you have the same Japan problem. So that correction can, in China's case, can only be corrected by creating a market. And to create a market, you need sentiment, and that is the challenge of the Chinese Communist Party. How they don't know how to create sentiment. They cannot get people excited enough. The wealth effect is destroying consumption. So they are in a downward spiral, literally in a depressionary spiral, and they have this challenge of getting people to start consuming just after they've lost 90% of their savings in a real estate crisis. How do you do that? I don't know anybody who's managed to do that. So, and the Chinese Communist Party in general, lose out when they have to handle the emotions of people. That's why I liken them to military columns rather than herds. Whenever any communist party or any autocracy comes up against emotions of people, they can't get people to feel good. And that seems to be China's problem. They've gone into a depression, but I can't see a new deal coming up.
Very, very,
Space.
very quickly, Manoj, do you see the possibility of a repeat of the Tiananmen Square protests and the subsequent suppression and repression in this day and age in China?
Highly, highly unlikely.
Hmm.
Look, we'll have lots more to lose. I think we forget what Tiananmen was about, right? It was multi-causal. One big cause was it was a country which had just opened up, where you had lots of people who had traveled to the West, who had come back, and who talked about how the West was completely different, how life was completely different, how there was so much more abundance, there was opportunity, and you were coming back to a country like China, which was not that. Today's China is not 1980s China. Today's Chinese youth don't look at the West and say, that's my model. I mean, nobody in China is today looking at Washington, D.C. and saying, that's a great political system, or that's an egalitarian society, or that's a society which takes freedom seriously. And part of that is just what's happening in the West, but part of that is also Chinese propaganda, which has instilled some of these ideas. And COVID was an example of that, right? I mean, the Chinese people genuinely believed the fact that the West bungled it, whereas China did a fantastic job at it. So I don't think that therefore you're likely to see some sort of a pushback, or, which is systemic and which wants to overthrow the system or anything like that. Yes, will you see protests around specific issues? Yes, and those have always happened in China. And again, like I say, the Communist Party has adapted. There's a reason. I mean, if you just think of air pollution, right? In the early 2000s, people
Correct.
talked about pollution in Beijing. You go to Beijing today, the air is fantastic.
Yeah.
I lived in Beijing when I saw the worst of air pollution and I saw the cleanup happen. So the Communist Party is adapting because it's
Not just
recognizing.
air pollution, noise pollution. I remember standing outside the Great Hall, and as on the steps, and as traffic, like I think it was 6 or 8 lane traffic, whizzed by, pure
Yeah.
silence. I could just hear the wind, and it was amazing.
And that to me is a recognition of the party that we need to respond to some of these concerns because they can become politically salient. And they sometimes do it ham-handedly, they sometimes do it well, but eventually they are trying to respond, and I think people tend to acknowledge that. At the same time, there's a recognition that this is a deeply venal, corrupt party. It's not like anybody's living in paradise, but the recognition of, look, if not this, then what else? What's
And
our
the
alternative?
military, equally corrupt. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that that is also something that we need to keep in mind. So protest. You think about, what do I stand to gain and what do I stand to lose? And if more people have a stake in the system and are wealthy and well off because of the system, they don't tend to protest. If people don't have as much of a stake in the system and they feel that they are net losers and substantively losers, they protest, right? They push back. Today, I think predominantly people feel that we are part of the system. The system has generally served us well. Yes, things are slowing down. Yes, my life may not be necessary, my kids' life may not be as safe as mine in terms of wealth creation, but it's still better off, right? Some of the memories of 40 years ago still exist. So therefore, I don't see some massive protest taking place. But then, never say never.
Never say never. Never rule it out. Absolutely. But
Manoj,
yeah.
if I can address this to you directly, how do you think the Chinese party is going to respond to the current challenges? Which I said, uh, one is the debate between debt default and savings repression, which way to go. Second is how to get consumption up in a time of depression. The wealth effect. These three or four factors put together, they're facing an emotional challenge
Yeah.
and not a physical challenge.
I agree with you. And what therefore you see, and I think the thing to keep in mind is that there is a recognition amongst the party. So if you just go back to last year, where they had what was called the third plenary session of the 20th Central Committee, which is an economic policy session, right? One of the headline items of that was, we need to rekindle and stabilize expectations. So we need to have this sort of, we need to rekindle some of these animal spirits, and we need to support consumption. What they're doing for that right now, and we can debate whether it's effective or not, is to try and subsidize consumption to some degree. You can do a lot more, right? So I agree with your assessment that historically, the state has essentially accumulated capital, and the state has then funded that through investments and then generated opportunities, and generated growth. A lot of that growth has been non-productive, which was evident in the property sector. So there are two, three things they're doing. One is that they are subsidizing consumption today by things like, old for new and things like that, right? You replace your old items with new items. Your new items will be technologically advanced, greener, whatever. Whether that's household consumption goods, whether that's cars or other things. The second policy that they're engaging in is that they're trying to forcefully shift consumption patterns across society, sorry, investment patterns across society, away from the property sector and into high technology sector. So if you see, I think a year and a half ago, there was a wonderful chart that Bloomberg had put out. But if you just look at their quarterly data that comes out, it'll show you that year on year, month on month, property investment continues to fall by by about 7, 8, 10%, whereas investment in high technology, high-end equipment and all continues to rise by the equivalent amount, right? 8, 9, 10%. So they're trying to shift the model of growth away from the property
Yeah.
sector. Now, the challenge in
And
that
that
is,
and that technology, mind you, you're talking about AI and robotics as critical parts of that technology, which hopefully, as China hopes, by 2027 will also address much of their problems with the workforce, when there's
that's
shortage of labor and
that's
demographic issues therein.
that's the hope. Yeah. So just to conclude that point, as part of that process of shifting, you're going to end up creating lots of overcapacity, and that's the model of their growth. So you're going to create overcapacity. That will lead to lots of failures also, but hopefully you will create two, three big champions. That's been the historic model in any technology domain. Um, in terms of property, which is where, like you said, the savings get hit and people then therefore don't consume. For the last 2.5 years, they have created a system to try and support the property market by trying to use, sort of make use of stock property, complete existing projects rather than do new investments, make use of stock property to create affordable housing, which the state can then buy, or state organs can then buy, and then they can start to sort of accommodate the migrants that are going to be coming in. And at the same time, try to reform your household registration system, the HUCO system, to give migrants access to some sort of public utilities which they were otherwise denied. So you're trying to create a new model of urbanization from what their old model was. So that's, and their hope is that as that happens and these people become part of the formal economy, they will also consume, right? So their hope is to try and bring all of that into the consumption pattern. It's a long process. It's not going to happen in a year or 2 years. It's a long process. And whether they succeed or not is also something that we'll see. But that's what they're trying to do. So there is recognition of the problem.
Interesting, fascinating. These are all rabbit holes, individual rabbit holes. I'd love to go down with you guys in subsequent chats, but we're already over time. Thank you so much, Manoj and Sanjeev, both for joining me today on this chat and Over the Horizon. I hope to see you back again soon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.